Welcome to the chalkboard, my fellow football nerds, for episode number 166 of Chalk Talk. I'm your host, Shane Haff, and you can follow me on Twitter and YouTube at ShaneHaffNFL. I'm joined today by the best co-host in the game. You've heard him on the Tough Cover radio show. It is Mark Henry Jr. Give him a follow on Twitter at MarkHenryJr_. Mark, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. We are 6 days away from the college football season kicking off. What are we from the NFL? It's probably, doing quick math in my head, like 12 days, right? Thursday, I guess.
Yeah, something. 2 weeks. No, it's 2 weeks from Thursday.
Okay. I got
because there's the
myself
off
hooked up.
week between week 3 and week 1.
Yeah, you're right. Got it. We're getting close. We're knocking on the door of football season. So anytime that could be the case, I'm doing well.
It is right there. Week 0 college football kicks off this weekend. Listeners of the Pinpole Network, you can tune in later this week. We're going to have an episode of the Armchair Scouts, our debut episode previewing week 0 of college football. Eagles prospects to watch. Mark's going to be on that show with me. That'll be a fun one later this week. But today...
By the way, it's week 0 and Dives is already stealing my players. It's all year. Dives he's a thief.
Yes, exactly. So we'll razz on Dibes some more in the show. Mark and I try to team up on Dibes as often as we can. So, but we're going to get into today our final divisional preview show. We've gone through 6 of the 8 divisions. The 2 we have are the AFC South and the AFC West. And so if you've missed any of those previews, be sure you go back and check them out. Again, this show is going to be focused on the NFL more at large, specifically the NFC East as we get into the season. But today we're going to tell you what you can expect from the South and the West. And so let's dive into it, Mark, with the AFC South. And we'll go in order of teams' places last year. So we'll start with the division-winning Houston Texans, who went 10-7 last year. And then they destroyed the Browns wildcard weekend, 45-14, before falling to the Baltimore Ravens, 24-10 in the divisional round. This offseason, I don't think they lost a lot. They lost Devin Singletary, Malik Collins, Jonathan Grenard, Sheldon Rankins. No real huge names there. The Grenard loss could hurt a little bit, but they were very active in the market adding players. They went out and they added Daniil Hunter, upgrade. They added Stephon Diggs, major upgrade. Azeez Al-Shaair, Joe Mixon, Danico Autry, C.J. Henderson, Jeffrey Okudah, Noah Brown. They added a lot of guys. And then I thought they did well in the draft considering not having a first-round pick from last year's trade. They got Kamari Lassiter, a guy that we both thought was a decent prospect. They got Blake Fisher, Kalen Bullock, Cade Stover. And so, didn't have a first-round pick. Part of trading up for Will Anderson, and that makes it a little harder in the draft. But I thought they did a really good job this offseason. I think the question for the Texans this year is, can C.J. Stroud keep it up in year 2? Nobody expected the leap that the Texans took last season. I mean, they only won 11 games in the previous 3 seasons combined. So to go 10-7, to win a playoff game, that's obviously totally unexpected. There's tape out there on Stroud now, and we've seen quarterbacks have shining rookie seasons and take a little bit of that sophomore slump, and I don't expect that from Stroud, but I think that's really the thing that could derail him, because you look at what he worked with last year in the receiver room, the offensive line. They had so many injuries on the offensive line. You just expect this team to continue to progress, and so they do have a hard schedule. It ranks 26th. It's the 26th easiest schedule. Their over-under is set at 9.5. Mark, where are you at with the Texans?
So I'm going over. I have them at 11-6, but it does feel like if I was trying to identify kind of the characteristics and traits of a team that everyone kind of picks as a sleek Super Bowl contender and same teams expected to take the leap, it does feel like they'd meet a lot of the criteria in terms of like a young quarterback coming off of a surprising season. They went out and they added big name veterans in Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs, who I think the public probably thinks are better than they are at this point. I think there's a legitimate argument that Stephon Diggs is the 3rd best receiver on the team. And I mean, the rebuttal argument to that is, well, then that means they have two other really good receivers, which they do. They are loaded for sure in the receiver room, even if Stephon Diggs is, I think, a little bit more washed than people think. And even if Joe Mixon's a little bit more washed than people think, they had a bad running game last year. So that's why I have those concerns about, it feels like this is a little too sexy. Feels like this is a little too easy, a little too, I think that there's people expecting them to progress from a 10-win team to a 12-win team, expecting Stroud to progress from maybe a fringe top 5 guy to being like right at the top of the league and an MVP candidate. And I think that's a hard leap. And I think we've seen a lot of teams struggle to take that leap. And I have them at 11-6. So not really putting my money where my mouth is. I'm kind of playing both sides of the fence here a little bit. But I have them as a playoff team. Would I be shocked if they went 8-9 or 9-8? No, but I'm going over.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have an over for them. I think they win their division, but
I actually don't, by the way.
Oh, okay. But I was going to say, you do look at some of the other teams in this division. This division's not the joke that it has been. You've got, the Colts, who are exciting. You've got the Jaguars, who maybe they take that leap finally. And then you got the Titans, who aren't really exciting at all, spoiler alert. But so I do have them winning their division. I have them taking the over. But I don't necessarily view them as like a true Super Bowl contender yet. I just don't think they're quite on that level, but I expect this young team to continue to grow.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't look at them as a Super Bowl contender either. I don't have them winning the division though. I have them at 11-6. I think they're my 6th seed when I went through it, but I feel like I am a little too high on them, to be honest. If I went through it again, there's a chance they'd end up 9-8, 10-7. But I'm going with a slight over, not one I'd bet.
All right, we've got a comment coming in here from Facebook from Michael. He has Texans winning the division, Jags 2nd, Titans 3rd, Colts 4th. So we'll keep those predictions in the back of our head as we kind of work through here and see how it shakes out for us. But let's move on to the team that finished 2nd in the division last year. They were 9-8. They were 2nd in the division by virtue of a tiebreaker, but still missed the playoffs. It's the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then this offseason, they lose Calvin Ridley, which was kind of a total botch job after what they traded for him to let him hit free agency, but have a handshake deal in place, and then he signed somewhere else. That was weirdly handled. They lose Rashawn Jenkins and Foley Fatukasi, and then they went out. They were kind of pigeonholed into, we need wide receiver help now, and so they way overpay for Gabe Davis. They had to draft Brian Thomas Jr., which I don't hate the pick, but that's all they could do. I mean, that was probably the most mocked draft selection in the entire process, was Brian Thomas Jr. to the Jags. They signed Mitch Morse, Darnell Savage, Ronald Darby, Eric Armstead, Josh Allen. So they sort of load up at receiver and on the defensive side of the ball. And so for the Jaguars, the question is, can Brian Thomas Jr. step in right away? Like, he has to, because they have Christian Kirk. Obviously, you got Gabe Davis, but I don't love this wide receiver room right now. They need Brian Thomas Jr. to be that wide receiver one right away. And then on the defensive side of the ball, will all the signings raise the floor of the defense? They were 16th in yards per carry allowed last year. They were 26th in pass yards allowed and 22nd in total defense last season. So you get a lot of names. Darnell Savage, Ronald Darby. You get Eric Armstead, Josh Allen, the pass rusher, not the quarterback, obviously.
Josh Hines Allen now.
Yeah. And so does the defense take a step forward? This is a team that's invested a lot into this defense and had a lot of picks flop with Trayvon Walker and Devin Lloyd took a step last year. Devin Lloyd. I knew Bush was wrong as soon as I said it. He did take a step. So they need those returns to pay off. They need some of these vets to step in and shore it up. And we'll see. They have the 14th easiest schedule. Their over-under is at 8.5. Where are you at with the Jags?
One of my favorite overs on the board at 8.5. I also have them at 11-6. The way it played out, the tiebreaker gave it to the Jags. I had them splitting their season series, and it just worked out that way. I'm all in on the Jags post-type sleeper season here. And I know that there is some concerns on defense, but you look through each kind of facet of it, and it feels like they should be at least average at every facet of defense. But Josh Allen on the edge. Trayvon Walker stinks. I think we can all admit that at this point. Not that me and Shane were kind of ahead of the curve on that way back when he went number one. But Eric Armstead is a big addition on the interior defensive line. And it means that maybe Trent Baalke can just stop swinging and missing and taking defensive linemen. Go out and pay your defensive linemen because clearly you're not very good at drafting them. But Devin Lloyd and Ololokun both finished as top 20 linebackers on PFF last year. Cisco and Savage both finished as top 35 safeties. They also have Amos and Gibson who finished pretty well last year. Like, they just have a lot of options in the secondary. They don't have maybe the number one corner or the top tier, top three safety in the league, but they have a lot of guys. And I just think if you look at each level of the defense, they have guys, like you said. And I think that they'll be better this year. We always say defense year to year is definitely more, it fluctuates more. So them being the 22nd defense, I think they could pretty easily improve to 11th or 12th just by way of adding Armstead and getting a little bit more turnover luck. But the biggest thing that you're buying into, if you're buying into the Jags, is you're buying into the fact that I don't know if Shane has watched the video that went around this offseason of all of the Trevor Lawrence either dropped passes or like mismanaged getting your feet out of bounds, especially in the end zone. Feels like he missed like a dozen touchdowns because of guys like Calvin Ridley and Evan Ingram not being able to get their feet in. But I just think that there's going to be positive regression for Trevor Lawrence. Travis Etienne really took a step last year. And I think there's a lot of people looking at Calvin Ridley leaving and they're like, man, that guy got $100 million elsewhere. The Jags really wanted him. I think Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr., one of them will be better than Calvin Ridley was last year. I don't know which one. I would bet Thomas if I had to bet one. I think Calvin Ridley stunk last year. And I know he probably had like 70 catches, around 1,000 yards. Watching them week in and week out, he was so up and down. And there were games that he was locked in, and there were games he played pretty well. There were games where I felt he really actively hurt the Jags. So I think that they are going to be better in the receiving corps, even if it doesn't look as sexy name-wise. And you still have Etienne and Ingram, who did really well. I'm buying in. And the biggest concern, obviously, is someone we know pretty well here in Philadelphia. His name's Press Taylor, and that's the concern. But the one thing I will say is, and it's kind of the Eagles argument. This team was, what were they, 8-3? Yeah, this team was 8-3 through 11 weeks last year. And yeah, they go 1-5 down the stretch. 3 of those 5 losses were by a possession or less, 2 of them to playoff teams. So it just feels like the Jags had the worst possible mix of outcomes at the end of last season with injuries. Trevor got a little banged up as well. And it was just a total catastrophe. That's why it was a total catastrophe and they went 9-8. So over 8.5 to me feels like one of the best bets in the NFL.
Yeah, I have the Jags missing the playoffs. I have a hard time going back to the well and trusting the Doug Peterson, Press Taylor brain trust.
Sure.
And I've been burned by it too many times. I've been burned by it as an Eagles fan. I was burned by it as a big Jags advocate last year. I have a hard time trusting that until I see it not disappoint. And so, we talked about when we did our QB rankings, Trevor Lawrence, like, it's time to grow up and stop turning the ball over, because I swear Trevor Lawrence has like one of the dumbest turnovers you'll ever see every other week. And it's always in the red zone. And he always plays stellar football before and after it, and we kind of wave it away. Like, I need to see Trevor Lawrence take care of the ball. I need to see, and I've seen the video you're talking about. Like, he got a lot of touchdowns taken off the board last year. But I need to see him take care of the ball. I need to see the defense come together, and I need to see Press Taylor stop calling offensive plays, probably. So I have a hard time buying into this team. I'm going to be pulling for him, but I unfortunately, I've got him on the outside looking in my playoffs.
Are you going under 8.5 though?
I have a hard time with that number because I right at 8, 9. If I had to pick, I would take the over. Probably I'd probably see him around 9 and 8 again. But no, that's not one I would really want to bet.
Yeah, I just locked it in. So I'll just a little aside here. I'll leave one out because it's coming up. I locked in my 5 favorite NFL overs, and that was my 3rd favorite. So I locked in Steelers over under 8.5, which we talked about last week. That was my favorite one. Bengals under 10.5. Also talked about that. Jags over 8.5 and Giants under 6.5. And then one we'll get to in the AFC West.
All right. Well, let's keep rolling along here. Let's talk about the Indianapolis Colts, who also went 9-8 last season, but finished third by virtue of the tiebreakers. They lose Gardner Minshew, who was supposed to be their backup to begin with, but ended up playing the majority of the year. They lose Zach Moss. They added Raekwon Davis, Joe Flacco, Julian Blackmon, and in the draft it was Leatu Latu, who was one of our favorite defensive players, and then A.D. Mitchell. This is a team that is in full run-it-back mode. And so the question is, will the run-it-back approach work with Anthony Richardson at the helm? I mean, the Colts were on the fringes of the playoffs last year, despite the quarterback they selected with a top 5 pick missing the majority of the season. They did it with a backup. Now, they may not have been as good if Richardson had played last year because dynamic athlete, doesn't have a ton of reps at the college level. He needed to learn. So you could make an argument they were better with Gardner Minshew than they would have been with Richardson. But it ultimately hurts his team in the long run that Richardson doesn't get those reps. And so, is he going to be able to step in? Can he stay healthy? Because in the 4 games he played, I think he left 2 or 3 of them early with an injury. And if he can stay healthy, is he going to play like a rookie? Like, we were expecting ups and downs from Anthony Richardson. I think there's going to be a lot of inconsistencies from him. I think he was my QB1 in that draft. CJ Stroud was real close behind, but he was my QB1 in that draft, and I liked some of the things I saw really early on, but you didn't see a lot because he didn't get to play a lot. So the Colts do have a favorable schedule. It's the 7th easiest in the NFL. Their over-under is also at 8.5. Where do you see the Colts?
I would never bet this. This is like out of if I were to rank like the 32 over and unders, based on my opinion, this might be 32nd. Like, this is a total, you cannot touch it. It's so dependent on what happens with Richardson and what Richardson is, and none of us know that. And Shane, you're not a fantasy guy. Anthony Richardson is being drafted like only behind Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen and like Mahomes and Lamar. He's in like the Mahomes-Lamar fantasy average draft position range. He's being drafted above Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, all these guys. And it's based on people in the fantasy community are losing their heads over that 4-game stretch in which he missed a lot of that stretch. And I understand there was impressive stuff in there. And I think there was some better passing than we expected right away from him. There was also some scattershot. There was some all over the place as well. He's obviously incredibly athletic. It's so hard for me to predict what this team should be. I think the A.D. Mitchell pick in the 2nd round was fantastic. That's now that's a legitimate receiver core if he's what they think he could be with Pittman, with Mitchell. Downs is kind of perfect as a slot guy. Jonathan Taylor, you paid him and took care of that. He's locked in there. The O-line should be amazing, really should be one of the best O-lines in football. The front 7, lot to like. The 2 big things that you have to worry about with this team is Anthony Richardson and what would happen if Joe Flacco comes in. I don't think you're getting 2023 Browns Flacco if he comes in. And the big question that no one's talking about, this secondary leaves a lot to be desired. You have Julian Blackmon as your best safety. I'm pretty meh on him. You're probably going to have to start Nick Cross, who was a rookie last year I guess 2 years ago from Maryland. Your corners, Kenny Moore, he's definitely solid. He's now about to turn 31. Juju Brents, who was a pick last year in the 2nd round. He was fine. Wasn't very good. Wasn't very bad last year, but still really young. Could definitely grow in. Jalen Jones was a 7th round pick last year. He was bad. I heard someone talking on a podcast talking about I guess there's some ranking based on the quarterbacks you face in a season. And I think the Colts got really lucky with especially down the stretch with the quarterbacks that they faced. And maybe that they were kind of saying the secondary didn't get tested as much as it should have. So we're not coming into this year as worried as we should be about this secondary. And it made me kind of dive in and look at the depth chart. It's one of the worst secondaries in the NFL. So that's kind of the concern. And then Richardson. So I have them at 8 and 9. I would never bet it or say anything confident about what I think is going to happen. There's a world where they're a Super Bowl contender. Steichen's that good of a coach. Richardson's that dynamic. Taylor's great. The receiver core's great. The O-line's great. The front 7's great. If the secondary is not as bad as I think, let's say Juju Brents is really good. Maybe Nick Cross steps up into a role, and Anthony Richardson's what Shane thought he was when he made the QB1 prediction a couple of years ago. This team's that impressive in spots. So it's hard for me to say that after I said that they're going to go 8-9. But this team might have the widest range of outcomes in the NFL.
Yeah, I have the over for them slightly. Do they make the wild card? Ultimately, I think no. I think there's just going to be inconsistencies to Richardson in what is essentially year one that are going to be hard to overcome. But man, I think the spark's going to be there at times, and I think you get to the end of the season as a Colts fan, and you're probably going to miss the playoffs, but I think you're probably going to be excited about the direction of the team.
I agree with that.
And it's funny because as I talk through this division, you know, I am heavily invested in the Jags because of Doug Peterson and Trevor Lawrence. And I'm invested in the Texans because of CJ Stroud and how fun they were last year. And I had him, you know, number 2 on my board in that draft. And then the Colts because I had Anthony Richardson QB1 in that draft. And then we get to the Tennessee Titans, and I just don't care about the Titans. I mean,
I will love its guy.
Yeah, just, you know, it is what it is. They were 6-11 last year. They lose Derrick Henry. They lose Azeez El-Shaair, Aaron Brewer, Denico Autry, Sean Murphy-Bunting. Now, they did make the splashy moves. They went out and got L'Jarius Sneed. They got Calvin Ridley, Tony Pollard. They also
you didn't mention their biggest loss, though.
Who's that?
Vrabel.
Oh, yeah, that is true. And I still don't understand that.
Brian Callahan this year. And yeah, I think there's a lot of times where you see the coaching hire and you're like, oh, maybe that'll be exciting. I feel like 6-11 might have been too high for what they actually are.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both thought Vrabel was a good coach. In the draft, they get J.C. Latham, Tavondre Sweat, Cedric Gray. I mean, the question for the Titans this year is Will Levis the guy? That they didn't add QBs for QB competition. Rather, they decided to build around Will Levis. They bring in Brian Callahan, which you mentioned, who worked with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati. Like, maybe you harness that. Maybe Joe Burrow was just Joe Burrow and it wasn't Brian Callahan to begin with. I don't know, but they have a tough schedule. 27th easiest. Their over-under is at 6.5. I've got the under here. I don't expect the Titans to be an exciting football team this year. I think moving on from Vrabel was a poor decision. And I don't know that the money spent on Calvin Ridley was worth it. And L'Jarius Sneed, like, he's a good cornerback, but, man, it's scary paying a cornerback that's getting up there, as Eagles fans know. So I just don't know about this Titans team. I think they could be in for a long year.
I think they're in the number 1 pick conversation. I have them at 4-13. I actually have 3 teams in the AFC tied for the last place record in the AFC at 4-13. The Patriots, the Titans, and a team in the AFC West. I think I have them getting like the 3rd through 5th pick, which means that Will Levis probably won't be the quarterback next year. I think that the Titans are probably on the top of the list of teams that'll be looking for a quarterback next year. There were times where I thought Levis was a little bit more impressive than I expected him to be, like that one Monday night game. But if that Monday night game didn't happen, I think there's a chance we're even lower on Levis and what this offense can be. Yeah, I think Pollard really, really did not impress me last season. In Dallas, I was expecting him to have a big year replacing Zeke. He really disappointed. Now he's in a worse situation, kind of taking away carries from Tajay Spears, who I actually think should be the focal point. Pollard's going to, I think, weigh them down a little bit. I mentioned how I feel about Calvin Ridley. I think he's potentially the most overrated player in the NFL. So I don't think that adding him makes any sense to make this offense any better. Another just a quick fantasy anger thing. He's going like 3 rounds before DeAndre Hopkins, and it makes no sense to me. It makes absolutely no sense. Hopkins is the better player, and also Hopkins played with Levis last year and developed a chemistry. Now Ridley's just supposed to walk in and be the wide receiver 1. I don't get that, but yeah, I'm going pretty easily here on the under. Not much more to say about it.
All right. Well, let's move.
Actually, I one last thing I wanted to say about it. That was so funny that I said nothing to say, and then I was like, I forgot to mention this. J.C. Latham, we disagree on this. I think that was a terrible pick at number 7. I think you kind of wasted a 6-11 year to get a guy who I think is like a fringe first rounder, like a fringe top 20 guy. I'd have to look back at where I had him. I know I had him probably late teens into the 20s. And I think Shane and Dives were much higher. But, I mean, he went over guys like Roma Dunze, Olufashanu, Brock Bowers, Fuaga, Latu, Dallas Turner, like Amarius Mims. Like, I think him going over those guys was crazy. So I'm not a fan of even what they did to kind of try to rebuild.
Yeah, I had him 12. You had him 21. Yeah. But I also think that him going over Fashanu is insane. So
and Odunze, we were both high on Odunze. They could have just drafted Odunze and not spent $100 million on a bad receiver in Calvin Ridley. But I digress.
All right,
Calvin Ridley's agent and lawyers are going to come for me because I feel like I've been coming after him the last couple shows and on my radio show.
Yeah, they might. Okay, let's go to the AFC West, where we have the Kansas City Chiefs, last year's Super Bowl champions. They go 11-6. They win the Super Bowl, and their path to the Super Bowl was a 3-point win over Buffalo, a 7-point win over Baltimore, and then a 3-point overtime win against the 49ers. They lose L'Jarius Sneed, who we talked about briefly with the Titans. They also lose Donovan Smith, which could potentially be a big deal, their offensive tackle from a year ago. They lose Willie Gay Jr., Marquez Valdez-Scantling. In the offseason, they bring in Hollywood Brown. They draft Xavier Worthy. They draft Kingsley Suamataia, who I thought was a great pick for the spot where they got him. However, they let Donovan Smith walk. Kingsley Suamataia seems to be their projected starter. And so is he ready to step in as a rookie and play left tackle for the Chiefs? That's a big thing to watch. Now, we know sacks are a QB stat, and Mahomes has one of the lowest pressure to sack rates in the NFL. But you don't want to get back to the place where you were last year, where the offense was just a mess. Now, obviously, they win the Super Bowl, so it seems silly to even talk about it. But when you add in, if the receivers are the same this year, and now all of a sudden your left tackle situation is a disaster, how do you overcome that? So Kingsley Suamataia, all eyes are going to be on him early. And then you look at the defense, they get Chris Jones back, worked out on a long-term deal, but you do lose Sneed. How's that going to impact the defense? Now, I got a lot of confidence in Steve Spagnuolo, got a lot of confidence in Trent McDuffie, but he's apparently starting outside now, and he's kind of been a slot cornerback, and so we've seen that movement go poorly for smaller guys before. So there's some moving pieces here. Overall, they do have a fairly easy schedule. They're 12th easiest in the NFL. Their over-under is at 11.5, and I'm taking the over because they haven't been under that number since Mahomes became the starter. So feels silly to bet against that. I'm sure that like week 7, somebody's going to write a piece about how the Chiefs' reign of terror is over, and then they're going to end up in the playoffs and they're going to end up in the Super Bowl again. I don't expect it to always be pretty, but I fully expect him to win this division and be in the playoffs, making a serious push in January.
Patrick Mahomes, well, they actually did go under this number this year for the first time, but every other year they would have went over it. My concern is that they don't care about the regular season, and they're just going to do like they're going to win the division, and then that's fine, and they'll figure it out from there. So I wouldn't bet the win total probably, but you look at, Mahomes has played 6 years. He's won the Super Bowl 50% of the time. He's went to the Super Bowl 66% of the time. He's went to the conference championship 100% of the time. It's unbelievable. No one's ever had it. I said this. I was actually looking up old tweets of mine about Mahomes to find a certain stat from a year or two ago, and I found an old Chalk Talk clip from last year around this time. Actually, I think it was more like May or June. But I was making the argument before Patrick Mahomes went out and won a Super Bowl this year with no good receivers. I was making the argument that Patrick Mahomes had the best 5-year run in the history of sports. Any athlete that you wanted to pick out, NBA, LeBron, Jordan's best 5-year runs, whoever you wanted to pick out for me, I think that the 5-year run from Mahomes, that's before he went out and won another Super Bowl, his 3rd Super Bowl. I think his 6-year run now is just, there's nothing that could ever touch it in my lifetime in sports, at least. So the guy is, you just write him into the Super Bowl at this point. When you're making your Super Bowl predictions, if you want to look smart, you want to actually get your Super Bowl prediction right, predict the Chiefs to go to the Super Bowl because it's the right prediction. I do think there's a chance that the defense is just a little bit worse, just natural regression. You lose Sneed, Jones getting a little older. I think they're probably going to be like a fringe top 10 defense instead of maybe like fringe top 3 defense last year. I'm not looking at the metrics from last year right in front of me in terms of like DVOA or anything like that, but it definitely felt at times like they were a top 3 to 5 defense. I don't think we'll feel like that this year, but I think there's a chance with the additions of Worthy, if Hollywood Brown gets back healthy, I think there's a chance Mahomes' numbers go up again. And we kind of see Mahomes as the exciting quarterback that we didn't get to see a lot of the time last year, with a couple more weapons out there. And the O-line is the X factor on that. But yeah, I think they'll be back in the Super Bowl and they'll probably win it.
I mean, exciting Mahomes. We've already got him throwing behind the back passes in the preseason.
Exactly.
Like half the teams in the league are like, we're not going to play our starters. And the Chiefs trot Mahomes out there to Harlem Globetrotters it with Travis Kelce. It's just infuriating at times.
Yeah, I saw the Solak tweet. I think it was Solak. He said, imagine being like a third string linebacker on the Lions trying to make the team. And Mahomes just throwing behind his back against you. like what the hell? Yeah, he's too good, man. He's doing side quests.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the team that finished second in this division last year, again by virtue of tiebreaker. It's the Las Vegas Raiders. They went 8-9. This offseason, they lose Josh Jacobs. They lost Jermaine Illuminor, Bilal Nichols, and Austin Hooper. But they went out and they added Christian Wilkins, Michael Gallup, and Gardner Minshew. And then in the draft, they drafted Brock Bowers and Jackson Powers Johnson. The big question for the Raiders, was Antonio Pierce the right hire? I mean, hiring a coach who has only been in the NFL for 2 years and was a linebacker coach is dicey. Will he be as appealing to his players when he's not following the clown show that is Josh McDaniels? We're going to have to wait and see on that. However, I went back and looked at it, and you can basically say the Raiders have botched their last 9 head coaching hires, so maybe it was time to try something different. They bring in Gardner Minshew, a guy that almost had the Colts in the playoffs last year. Can Antonio Pierce get what he got out of the defense last year? Can the offense function at a competent level without Josh Jacobs, who didn't have a great year last year anyways? Their schedule's not great. It's the 24th easiest schedule, but their over-under is only at 6.5. And I think this is a easy over for me on the Raiders.
My boldest prediction of the NFL season is that the Raiders are going to go 10-7 and make the playoffs. I am pushing my chips all the way in on the Las Vegas Raiders over 6.5. Right behind the Steelers is my favorite win total of this season. I got to go find whatever their prop is to make the playoffs. Probably plus 400, plus 500. Christian Wilkins is the most important addition in the NFL this year, in my opinion. Maybe the most important subtraction too. We'll see from the Dolphins, but I think Wilkins is the best player that changed hands on any team in the NFL. I went through it and kind of looked at it after I said that last week. I couldn't think of a team or a player that I thought was better that switched teams. The only guy that I could think of that was even really close is Saquon, and I think Wilkins is a much more important player than Saquon, just to be honest. So I think that defense was a top 3 defense, maybe even top 1 in a lot of metrics once Pierce was hired last year. And Max Crosby, one of the best defensive players in football, does not leave the field. And now you add Christian Wilkins on the inside, who does not leave the field. And I think that's going to be a huge addition. Malcolm Kuntz really stepped up into a nice role. You have Tyree Wilson, who you drafted in the first round last year. He was terrible, but around all these other guys, maybe he gets a little room to grow a little bit. You have some other names up front that are pretty solid linebackers. Jack Jones is turning into a star, I think, at corner. They're not that deep in the secondary, but I think that front 7 is going to be good enough that they're going to be one of the best defenses in football. And I trust Antonio Pierce and his defensive coordinator abilities, I guess you could say. And I think, you said, who knows if he's not going to be as loved by the players as he was following the clown show. I think that's the one thing I'm not worried about with Antonio Pierce. I think that team is just so bought in to everything he's preaching them. I think the people that are saying that they're going to be one of the worst teams in the AFC or they're going to finish last in this division, I think it's crazy. I think they're way better rosters than the other 2 teams in this division. And that's kind of the biggest reason. I think Denver's bad, and I think the Chargers are really bad. So I think the Raiders are just significantly better than those teams roster-wise. People don't realize how good Devontae Adams was last year, especially with like Aiden O'Connell throwing him the ball. It was pretty unbelievable. They went 9-8 with the worst quarterback in football last year, potentially, with Aiden O'Connell. He was probably only better than Zach Wilson and Desmond Ridder. So they had like the 30th best quarterback situation. They went 9-8 after a disastrous start with Josh McDaniels. So I just think that there's natural. The Gardner Minshew is going to be fine. Like Gardner Minshew is not going to kill you at the quarterback position. The problem with the Raiders is having no QB. Their quarterback's better than it was last year when they went 9-8. Definitely. Like there's no argument that Gardner Minshew is not better than what they had with Jimmy G for 4 weeks and then with Aiden O'Connell for the rest of the way. So I look at that Josh Jacobs was also terrible last season. I don't think that was real. I think running backs have weird up and down seasons sometimes. He is getting older. There's a chance maybe he's washed, but I don't think that the downgrade from Jacobs to White is going to matter at all. I think Zamir White's going to be fine, maybe even gives him a little more upside at the running back position. Jacoby Myers, perfectly fine receiver too. Brock Bowers, there's a chance Brock Bowers is just what Sam Laporta was last season. I mean, we were that high on him as a prospect. I don't think anybody would be shocked if he stepped in and turned into a top 7 tight end right away. He's that gifted. So I'm all in, Shane. I this could look dumb in a couple months when they go 5-12 and fire another coach, but I'm buying in.
All right. I am not that bought in, but I do not have them finishing last in the division. I think they'll have a solid season. I don't have them in the playoffs, though, but I think it'll be a positive season for the Raiders.
No one does. And I understand why. I'm almost making a little bit of a statement by doing so, but I'm buying it. I love this defense.
All right. Well, let's go on to the Denver Broncos, who also were 8-9 last year. They lose. I don't know if you consider this losing. They lose Russell Wilson, and they throw a party about it. They also lose Jerry Jeudy, Lloyd Cushenberry, and Justin Simmons. They added John Franklin Myers, Levi Wallace, Cody Barton, and Josh Reynolds. And then in the draft, they drafted Bo Nix and Troy Franklin. I think the big question for the Broncos, the only question for the Broncos is how is Bo Nix going to do as a rookie? He was drafted 12th overall. He was 59th on my board, 60th on Mark's board. However, he has looked good in the preseason. The Broncos have scored on 6 of his 7 drives. And, I mean, it is the preseason, but it makes you feel good if you're a Broncos fan. This season is not about getting to the playoffs. It's about getting Bo Nix reps. And if he is the guy, you can add a lot around him next offseason as Russell Wilson's dead cap hit starts to fall off the books. And you have your own picks now. And so it's all about Bo Nix. It's all about his development. They do have a tough schedule, 25th easiest overall. Their over-under is at 5.5, and I'm taking the under. I don't believe in this team. I don't believe in Bo Nix, and I'm starting to doubt Sean Payton a little bit. But I don't know if that's fair given the quarterbacks he's had to work with.
What I would say is that you can't think two things. You can't think that Sean Payton stinks or he's washed or whatever, and you can't think that Russell Wilson's terrible. Because Russell Wilson put up good numbers last year, and they won 8 games, and that team's bad. So I think one of two things has to be true. It's either we're throwing out Russell Wilson a little bit too early in the trash, or Sean Payton still has it as a scheme guy. I think it's probably that. I think Sean Payton's still probably really good as a scheme guy. You can make a case maybe GM Sean Payton has some answering to do. That there's definitely that argument. It's almost back to like a couple of years ago with Belichick a little bit. But I think Sean Payton did a really good job coaching last season. But I don't think Bo Nix will be that much worse than what Russ was last year. Like I'm going over on the 5.5. I think they get like 6-7 wins. I had them at 7-10. Their defense is not appealing. Like that's the concern, is that their defense is just going to be terrible and you don't have good quarterback play. But I think that there's pieces on offense to like. I think Cortland Sutton had a really good year last year, kind of under the radar. Javonte Williams closed the year really well, and he's now 2 years removed from his ACL injury. I think there's a chance he's kind of been thrown out and forgotten about. I think he could have like a top 5, top 10 running back season kind of out of nowhere to give them a little upside on offense. But yeah, I just think that Sean Payton's probably a little bit too good of a coach to totally bottom out, which almost hurts the Broncos a little bit if Bo Nix isn't the guy. But I think they'll be competitive and probably get blown out against good teams, but be competitive against the mid to bad teams.
Yeah, I don't think there's much weapon-wise on the offense. Like Cortland Sutton is there. You've got Troy Franklin. Granted, he was a day 3 rookie.
who's been horrible in training camp, by the way, like a potential cut candidate.
I didn't realize he'd been that bad, but
Marvin, he's been getting talked up though.
My boy.
Marvin Mims. It's big Shane half hours. Yeah. It's funny. I was watching their preseason game at a fantasy draft last weekend. And he had a nice catch down the field. And I was like, oh, there's Shane Hath's boy, Marvin Mims. And then he got a touchdown. And I was like, that's Shane Hath's guy. Like, I was like telling my friends it was funny. But he's actually kind of becoming a sneaky late fantasy sleeper, like the 15th, 16th round. So maybe Marvin Mims can step into a role. But yeah, it's not a deep receiver.
Yeah, let's go. You heard it here first. Marvin Mims. Okay, let's roll on to the last place team in this division from a year ago. It's the Los Angeles Chargers, who had a horrible season. They go 5-12. They fire Brandon Staley. They lose Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Kenneth Murray, and Eric Kendricks. They went out and they added the Baltimore Ravens, basically. Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Hayden Hurst. They get Bradley Bozeman.
Just the guys they didn't want.
Yeah. And then they drafted Joe Alt, which fantastic pick. They get Ladd McConkey. They get Junior Colson. So they had some good moments in the draft. My question for the Chargers, I got several questions for the Chargers, but who is Justin Herbert throwing the ball to? He's got Josh Palmer, Ladd McConkey, who's a rookie that wasn't a first-round pick. You've got DJ Shark, who has not done much in his career. Quentin Johnston, that's his wide receiver room. That's very troubling. And then you look at the defense. Can the defense take a step forward? I mean, they were dreadful last year. 30th against the pass, 28th overall. Now, I think Jesse Minter might be able to get something going with them. And you look at like the abomination that was everything about this team with Brandon Staley. And you look at Harbaugh coming in and Jesse Minter, and they come, are they going to be able to instill this winning culture and thing? But the thing I keep circling back to, they have the second easiest strength of schedule. They were 3-8 in one-score games last year. You would expect a bit of positive regression there, just like we talked about with Trevor Lawrence and the passes that guys couldn't get feet down or negated by penalties, all the touchdowns. You would expect to not go 3-8 in one-score games a second year in a row. And so their over-under is set at 8.5. I have grave concerns about the receiving room. Maybe it doesn't even matter the way Harbaugh wants to play football. I don't know. I do have the over for them. I think they fight for the last wild card spot with the Colts. That's my prediction. I think it's going to come down to them and the Colts for that 7 seed in the division or in the AFC. But I guess I said the Colts wouldn't make it, so I guess I'm picking the Chargers, but I have a lot of fear and trepidation about it.
I think the Chargers have the worst roster in the AFC. I have them at 4-13, so their under is one of my favorite bets. I think they gutted this roster. Jim Harbaugh was like, I don't want any Chargers, and the problem is they had some talented guys. I just think this is going to be a disastrous season. Harbaugh wants to play 1985 football, and Herbert is just going to get excuses all year because he doesn't have any receivers and he really doesn't have any weapons. So he's not being drafted really as a fantasy quarterback option this year after being like a starter for years and years. I don't see it. Like, I don't know where they're really that good. Like, I'm looking at their defense. It's Mack and Bosa. They should be good up front. Obviously. Derwin James was nowhere near as good as he was in the past last year. Asante's pretty good. They have some names on defense. I guess if you wanted to argue that their defense could be really solid, sure. I just don't think their offense is going to be good at all. I don't think their running games, like, they want to be this 1985 rushing attack and run 400 times, and they're being projected to run the most in the NFL. Their starting running backs are Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, and a 7th-round pick. I actually think Kamani Vidal might end up being the most talented guy on the team. He's like kind of a fantasy darling right now. I love that as a little bit of a sleeper. I know Shane's a Kamani Vidal guy. So, but I don't see it with this offense.
All right. So you basically have, I think we were pretty similar on the AFC, but you have the Raiders making the playoffs, and I had the Chargers making the playoffs. Other than that, I think we were the same, right?
I had the Jags in.
You had the Jags in, and I did not.
Yeah, so who did you have in that I did?
It was the Dolphins, but
the Bengals. You were in on the Bengals.
Oh, yeah, Bengals.
I'm out on the Bengals, yeah.
All right. Well, there you have it. That completes our AFC divisional previews. We will be back next week. We've got one more week. No, we got 2 more weeks till football season starts. We'll figure something out. But next week we'll be back. We'll do our annual awards draft, making selections for Super Bowl winner, offensive and defensive rookie of the year, MVP, player of the year, coach of the year, first coach fired, all of those things. So that's always a fun show that we can go back and revisit. But that's next week. Mark, before we get out of here for this week, do you got any final thoughts for the people?
Final thoughts. I'm trying to think about a fantasy thought that could help the people out there. Do you have any final thoughts, Shane?
My final thought, I'm just going to say, make sure you guys are subscribed to the Eagles Pin Pull Network. We are going to be kicking off our draft show, the Armchair Scouts, this week. For longtime listeners of the BGN feed, it's basically the BGN draft show reincarnated, but there's only 4 games this weekend for week 0 college football, but we'll give you Eagles targets to watch. We're going to give you player of the week predictions. We'll preview the game of the week, and so you guys be sure and check that out. That'll drop in your feed later this week, along with all the other great shows on the feed. So that's my final thought. Did I buy you enough time, Mark?
Yes. I was looking for, I have a list of stats here from my radio show for fantasy, and I thought this was a fun one since you were a big Kyle Pitts guy when you came out of the draft, right, Shane?
Yes.
Are you buying into the Kyle Pitts revenge redemption tour?
Somewhat.
I got all my stocks tied up in the Kyle Pitts revenge tour.
I have trepidation about the Kirk Cousins situation with injury, but if I was confident in that, I definitely would be.
Over the last 2 seasons, Kyle Pitts ran just 20% of his total routes with a linebacker against him, and 65% of his targets were uncatchable. That is shocking. Both of those numbers are shocking. And Zach Robinson, their new offensive coordinator, has been talking Pitts up and saying they want to get him isolated on linebackers and even sometimes safeties. And instead of Kyle Pitts has these receiver skills, let's use him as a receiver. It's no, Kyle Pitts has these receiver skills. Let's use him as a tight end and get him lined up against linebackers, get him lined up against non-corners, because that's when you get the mismatch. And we've seen that with Travis Kelce for years and years and years. So Kyle Pitts, it's the year.
All right, there you have it, the Kyle Pitts year. Thank you guys for joining us for episode number 166 of Chalk Talk. If you enjoy what you heard on the show, and we know that you do, smash that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. Drop us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter. I am at Shane Half NFL. He is at Mark Henry Jr., and we will catch you guys next time.